White House releasing their fact sheet on tariffs. Fact sheet details temporary 10% tariff. Temporary tariff is to be taking effect from February 24th. Today is February 21st. Critical minerals, fewer metals have been exempted. Pharmaceutical products have been exempted from 10% tariff. Aerospace products have been exempted from the 10% tariff. These are the preliminary details that we are bringing to you of what all that fact sheet in fact entails. But yes, remember the 10% additional tariffs that we're speaking of, that's a particular announcement that's been made by the President of the United States after the SCOTUS, that is the Supreme Court of the United States, ended up coming up with a ruling which in fact declared that all of the tariffs that have been imposed and weaponized by the President of America is in fact unconstitutional, and he could not have been imposing these tariffs in the first place to begin with. And as we speak of this very story, let's take you through all that's happened so far to understand where we in fact are currently in the sequence of events that's unfolded within just the last 24 hours. Donald Trump has struck again after the US Supreme Court's decision to strike down his sweeping tariffs. Court ruled that Trump exceeded his authority when he imposed the tariffs using emergency powers. They said he needs congressional approval to be imposing those tariffs in the first place, but refusing to bow down. Instead, Trump has doubled down, wherein he's announced this 10% additional tariffs on all nations across the globe using the powers under Section 122. Trump insisted that the ruling will not be constraining him. Trump also sharply criticizes the verdict, calling the justices a disgrace, labeling the decision unpatriotic, and claiming that Democrats are thrilled by the ruling. Meanwhile, Donald Trump also claimed that the US-India trade deal remains unchanged amid all of what has happened, and he also praised Prime Minister Modi once again, calling him a fantastic leader or a man who's much smarter than the others. So this is where it all stands at this point, and we have Rohit Sharma joining us on the broadcast, bringing us all those details as he has been since yesterday when this entire news in fact came out. Rohit, very good morning to you from India. Just to understand one thing here, the fact sheet that's been released, if you could just take us through the summary, the main key takeaways from it as to what all it entails.
Well, look, Shreya, it is a very interesting fact sheet. I mean, it talks about how these 10% tariffs are global tariffs, how the president has authority over this, again, issuing another executive order to put these tariffs in place. It talks about how President Trump is going to be authorizing Department of Commerce to essentially investigate, items and countries where he can put tariffs on. But again, long story short, these are, again, temporary efforts. He has authority for only 5 months to do that. So I think President Trump is looking, to put in permanent tariffs, and that can only happen if he goes through the route of the Congress. If he is able to convince people, Republicans on the Senate and in the House, to be able to do this. He's very disappointed. But again, if one reads through fact sheet, it reiterates what he said during the press conferences, lays out a structure in which he thinks he would be implementing these tariffs. But then again, I think there is a broader question of, does he have authority to do that above and beyond that 10%? What is the maximum he can go, which we believe is 15% from what we've seen? And then it could also be challenged in courts in terms of how those exceptions would work, how those tariffs would work, and if he can extend those tariffs beyond a certain point. So at this point in time, I think it is definitely a big blow to President Trump's strategy, but he's looking at options. He's trying to see if he can put this in place for now and still negotiate trade deals in effect. And also he made an example of India, how that India would be still paying 18% because now we have a trade agreement. I think that is the most likely route he would like to go. Shreya.
Right, Rohit. So let's understand one thing. On one hand, just to summarize what's happened in the last 24 hours, on one hand, we see the United States Supreme Court coming out to say that the jurisdiction which Donald Trump has exercised to, in fact, impose the tariffs, that is, in fact, unconstitutional, given that he needed the congressional approval. To counter that very ruling, we see Donald Trump now coming up with an additional 10% tariff under that Section 122. I would just want you to take us a little bit through that Section 122, which he has used now, or rather which he has cited now, to be imposing these additional tariffs, because as you mentioned, he will be given a time frame of 5 months, 150 days after having announced these temporary tariffs to get congressional approval for that as well.
Yes, and this is something that was floated way back by Secretary Bessent. When it became clearer that the Supreme Court would probably rule against President Trump, that it would be one of those things that is inevitable in terms of what would happen. Now, this is the Section 122. I think 1974 Tax Act allows him to do that, but it also has some conditions apply. The big asterisk marks, where he could only do it as in emergency cases if the payment system were to fail. And he will have to prove these things. Again, if somebody takes him to court on this, he will have to put this and defend it in court if he has those powers to do it. Now, technically, yes, he does. He believes he can do that. That's why instead of 25%, 40%, 50%, he's starting at 10% because that I think he's trying to brace for another lawsuit at this point in time. So it does allow him to do that on a temporary basis. I'm pretty sure, Secretary Bessent and Commerce Secretary Lutnick have gone through the fine print of how they would want to do this. But at this point in time, Shreya, I think it's too early. We'll have to wait and watch. There were some Democrats who were actually hurdling on the Capitol Hill to see what they can do to fight this in court. So we'll have to wait and watch how this is implemented. But as far as, the 10% is concerned, I think he did not want to leave a vacuum in place because Supreme Court invalidated these tariffs. He wanted to put something out there so that the CBP can still charge some percentage, and I think they agreed on 10% today under Section 122. He can only go up until 15%, if I'm right, and if I read it properly. So we'll have to wait and watch what happens next. But that is the authority he has, and again, it is a temporary authority only for 5 months.
And the big question at this given point, and something that you have pointed out earlier, is with regards to the bill that Lindsey Graham, in fact, has at this given point of time. Senator Lindsey Graham has at this point of time. The probability of Donald Trump, in fact, using that as a counterblow to the entire ruling that's coming from the Supreme Court, because that would indeed, if that was the way that Trump would take now, that would come in quite as a weapon for the Trump administration to be utilizing at a point of time when the other tariffs that's imposed by Donald Trump is being considered, unconstitutional.
And I think that is the way to go. He was advised earlier by Senator Lindsey Graham to have Democrats and Republicans work on this bill that allows him to constitutionally, have a legitimate law that allows the president to put these tariffs, and not only for President Trump, for any future president. So I think there is that bait for even Democrats to work. I think even some Democrats acknowledge that these threat of tariffs has worked in the favor of America. And I think that would be the way to go. We, in fact, even saw a tweet from Senator Lindsey Graham that he's wanting President Trump to take that route. Now, it all depends if there's appetite on the Democratic side in the Senate, because the Republicans do have majority in the House, so they would be able to pass a bill in the House immediately. I think he will have to have enough Democrats, at least 10 of those, in the Senate to be able to pass any bill. So we'll have to wait and watch. But I think that essentially this Section 122 allows the president and Senator Lindsey Graham and other Republicans on the Capitol Hill to come up with a strategy, work with Democrats, negotiate a bill, and then pass it that allows President Trump to, again, constitutionally put these tariffs back in place. And I think that is a very, very viable option that Republicans will be looking at right now.
Right. Rohit, thank you